And there's this family story I've always known is that during the first Gulf War, my brother wrote a letter to George Bush Sr., basically just telling him, hey, here's the situation in Palestine and Iraq. And I was supposed to get a copy of the letter today, but my brother is traveling right now. He can't get his hands on it. And I will bring it at one point. But she said this letter, and I've always known about this letter that my brother sent to George Bush. And she said that one time we had Ambassador Wilcox over at our home for lunch after church on Sunday, and my brother handed the letter to you, and you promised that you would get it into the hands of George Bush. So I won't put you on the spot to ask if you actually did that or not. But anyway, it was just a fun connection to make. So
that's a great story. I'm glad to hear to give my warm regards to your parents.
Absolutely, I will. All right, Bill, thank you.
Okay, so today we're kicking off our 5-week forum series on the Holy Land, starting with some historical and geopolitical context on how we got to this point in terms of humanitarian crisis. So joining us today is Ambassador Philip Wilcox. Ambassador Wilcox is an expert in the region. Many of you will remember his forum lecture here a couple of years ago. Ambassador Wilcox has spent half his career working on this issue, first as a diplomat in the U.S. Foreign Service, then as the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. He has worked directly with Israelis and Palestinians for decades and has great admiration for both. Ambassador Wilcox will help us understand the complexities of the issue, the historical, political, and spiritual forces that have brought us to where we are now, and the responsibility we face as outsiders looking in to make change. We'll start with your remarks, Ambassador Wilcox, then we'll move into a short guided discussion, and then, as always, open up for your questions.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Sari, and Anne, and Lisa. I was here 2015, and I vividly remember it. I may have told this joke then, but I'll tell it again. We Americans believe that we learn from experience. We study, we conscientiously try to shape our views according to our real experience and what we have seen and learned. Reminds me of the story of the young kid who was graduating from high school, and his dad said, "You've got to get a job, son. Maybe you want to be a doctor or a lawyer?" And he said, "No, Dad, I want to be a railway switchman." There was lots of argument. But finally, his dad relented and said, "Okay, I'll pay for your fees." The kid went to the railway switchman school. He learned what to do out there, holding onto the switch. And he went before the board of examiners to get his license, and they said, "Son, what would you do if the Santa Fe super chief were barreling down the track at 100 miles an hour from the west, and on the same track, another train was approaching from the east, and you were standing at your switch? What would you do?" And he smiled and scratched his head, and he said, "Well, I go run and call my brother." And they said, "Well, what in the world would you do that for?" And he said, "Well, my brother's never seen a train wreck." So, and believe me, I don't have to tell you that for a long time we've been facing repeated train wrecks in our policy in the Middle East. I want to talk a bit about the history and then pause so we can have a good Q&A session. We've had a comforting illusion for many, many years, perhaps since the Camp David agreements, when Jimmy Carter made peace with Israel's greatest Arab enemy, the Egyptians. And we thought that there was an element of that, of course, which promised autonomy to the Palestinians with a view that that would lead to peace. And no one used the word two states in those days, but that was the direction. It didn't work that way, although Menachem Begin had promised to address the Palestinian issue as well as the Israel-Egypt conflict. But over the years, there were repeated processes, peace processes. We gave them different names. We worked very hard on them, as did others. We maintained the hope, indeed, often the illusion, that we were moving forward not rapidly, but we would reach the destination of peace and two states. Now, 45 years later, we have not, and we have failed. I say we, that is the United States, Israel, the Palestinians, and the Western community. That is a great tragedy, because this is not an incidental little footnote in history. This is a cosmic conflict that poses huge danger to both the protagonists, the Israelis and the Palestinians, and to the United States, and the community that believes in democracy, human rights, decency, and peace. So it's a big deal, and the fact that we have failed is not any reason for despair. It is a reason for trying harder, and we cannot do that now under our current administration, I regret, but there will be new administrations, and this effort to make peace must be restored in a much more vigorous and honest and effective way. It can be. We are a great nation. We have great influence and power, especially over the protagonists in this conflict. And we should use that advantage. We never have. Well, I've always been drawn by the famous statement of Martin Luther King. He may have drawn it from the Bible. I don't know where he got it. But he said the arc of history bends toward justice. And I believe it. I think you can objectively make a strong case by reading history to justify that. It's not been the case yet in this conflict. Indeed, it's bending backwards at the moment. Well, let's look at the basics of this conflict. It is a conflict between one nation and one proto-nation, but genuine nations, for the same land to which they have deep claims, of a different nature, but we cannot minimize the power of and I think, unending commitment to both of those countries for safety, self-determination in the Holy Land. The obvious answer, as I think you all know, is that the land must be divided. The idea that one side's going to win and the other will lose is folly. That is the view that the government of Israel has maintained now for some years, and the logic of that is deeply destructive for everyone, including the state of Israel, which is maintaining what I think is a suicidal policy for itself, not to mention the cruelty, the assault on justice, denial of justice to the Palestinians. Well, this is not Kurdistan or some minor anomaly of history. This is Israel and Palestine. And it threatens the entire region, indeed the entire world. Israel is a powerful nuclear nation. It's a very volatile area of the world. Palestinians are not going to give up by any means. The fact that there has been a lull in major violence and war doesn't mean that we won't face further horrible calamities in the future if we don't get back to the job of making peace. Now, this Western effort toward making peace, resolving the situation there, starting with the British in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, and proceeding through a whole series of peace processes, has never created a balanced playing field. The Western nations, beginning with the British, and then for much longer period, the United States, has pursued a biased and one-sided approach to this conflict, believing that we were doing the right thing, not quite understanding how ultimately we yielded to the Israelis repeatedly, and even Barack Obama, who was a brilliant man and had his heart in the right place, yielded at the end and did not take advantage of American power and influence with a nation which was heavily dependent on Israel, on the United States, the state of Israel. Now, why was this? There's a powerful cultural and religious element to this. When the conflict began, we had no knowledge, little knowledge of the Middle East, much less the Palestinians. But there was a beginning of consciousness in the United States that something had gone wrong in Western civilization and culture and religion. Christianity was the faith that embraced the notion of anti-Semitism, which is a deep and tragic sin. And so we were sympathetic toward the idea of Israeli self-determination and peace. When the diplomacy began to focus on Israel and Palestine. We remember that it started in the colonial era, where people of color, people that lived in the third world, were not considered equal, that the Turkish occupation and the British occupation of Palestine were quite normal, and that the Palestinians were not an equal or important factor in the resolution of the conflict. Now, that changed slowly when the Holocaust came. And the Holocaust, I think, had a jolting effect on the Western and Christian world. Obviously, it did. And the Israeli initiative, the Zionist initiative, grew up in very fertile ground. It probably would not have succeeded had it not been for the Holocaust, because for the Jewish people, they saw the conflict as a matter of life or death. Their refugees, their survivors were rejected by foreign governments. We would not admit them to the United States. And so we deepened our own involvement and responsibility throughout the years. And we believe that we had a very special obligation to Israel. That was a well-grounded assumption. We never, I think, had a sense of equal commitment to the Palestinians, who are another victim of history, and who, ironically, in an effort for self-determination, safety for the Jewish people, we helped deprive the people who live there and had lived there for 2,000 years of their right to self-determination, peace, and justice. So there's a heavy burden on our own country. We are not just an interested bystander. It's a moral paradox. Surely the Jews demanded and deserved justice, and we were right to support them. But we made a fatal error in not recognizing the consequences of Zionism and what it would do to the other contestant for the land. And we haven't yet, and indeed we're turning backward in that respect under the Trump administration. The British ultimately turned against their Zionist project, which began with World War II and the Versailles Treaty and the Balfour Declaration. They realized belatedly that it wasn't working and that their majority support for the Israelis was creating a tragedy for the Palestinians and sowing the seeds for further war and conflict. And so they backed away from Zionism, but the U.S. embraced it enthusiastically, not only because, but in large part because of the large and dedicated American Jewish community, who were becoming a more powerful and influential and self-confident element of our democratic society. And they saw they saw Zionism as ordained by basic principles of justice. And that community has had a massive effect on American policy, needless to say. So there was the Zionist Palestinian struggle was heavily influenced by domestic American politics. Well, thank you very much. The situation looked stable and even promising before 1967, when Israel invaded what are now called the occupied territories. And that created a profound change in Israeli politics. Rather than building upon their great success in creating a smaller state, they decided they wanted it all. And that movement was led by a very dynamic, determined, and religiously fanatic, if I could use that word, group of settlers who thought that the redemption, the coming of the Messiah, would be accelerated by Israeli conquest of what was left of the Jewish Holy Land in ancient Palestine. Well, the government of Israel at that time hemmed and hawed, never explicitly embraced conquest or acquisition of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, but in fact proceeded almost systematically to achieve that. Let's look at some maps here to see what happened after the '67 war. This was the pre-war arrangement, the Gaza Strip there in the gray and the West Bank and the Golan Heights up above. Then after '67, now this was after '48 when the UN proposed a partition of Palestine as the solution. Partition of Palestine is still the solution, but this was the formula that the UN came up with. The US ultimately endorsed this. Harry Truman, who was praised by the Israelis and many others for his pro-Israel position in 1948, in fact feared what would happen. He saw this as a recipe for further war and conflict. He wanted the UN to deal with the problem, somehow internationalize Palestine and Jerusalem. So the next, here is the partition plan of 1947 was reduced to this when Israel ultimately won the war in 1948, leaving the dark yellow areas in Palestinian hands, actually Jordanian hands and Egyptian hands at that time. Next. And then in '67, after this brilliant victory over the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Israelis were struck with a spirit of hubris and triumphalism and decided, look what we've done, or look what God has done for us. And let's go the rest of the way and permanently restore all of Palestine to Israeli Jewish control, and we'll have an even larger and more powerful state. And so the settlement movement began. The idea was to populate the occupied territories with Jews, and to do it in a way that would make it impossible to amalgamate a Palestinian state in that region by carving it up with settlements. Next. You can see in 1972 there were very few settlements, but you can see the progressive and systematic advance of settlements by these blue bars showing the massive growth of Jewish settlement over that period. It's more than 500,000 today. It has created a point where the West Bank is so full of settlements strategically placed to prevent the coalescence of a real, genuine Palestinian state, that there can never be peace. And Israel will triumph, and this will hasten the coming of the Messiah. Alas, that is the cruel reality that we face today, and it's getting worse. Next. And let's go through watching the sequence of this. You see how it happened. Look at the little triangles, which are settlements, and how they grew and grew and grew and grew until there was no way that you could have a Palestinian state in this area. Next. There is a settlement today just outside of Jerusalem. It's typical, these fortress-like structures, which are symbols of control and power, a kind of military fortress-like presentation. Go ahead. This is East Jerusalem from the Arab side, and a wall which began in the early 1990s, which now divides most of Israel from Palestine, just as Israel attempts to incorporate Palestine into the state of Israel. Next. Another one, pictures of settlements. Go ahead. Let's just go through these slowly. The Palestinian home demolished when the owner could not receive a building permit. There are thousands of these have taken place in the West Bank. The result of this was periodic horrible terrorism. The blue dots are Israeli settlements. The white dots are settlements also. This is roughly a pattern of the geography there now. Next, please. Go ahead, just we can go through these rather quickly. I just want to give you the idea of what the geography is there. No way can there be a Palestinian state. And this is done all systematically and intentionally to prevent just that. At the time that Israel was still engaging in, quote, peace talks with the US and the Palestinians and the rest of the world. There were Israelis who believed in this, and they thought it would work. They were our closest friends, but they were a minority. And the settlers themselves and the bulk of Israeli political society was never really committed to dividing the land, forfeiting the West Bank and Gaza. And today, the so-called peace camp in Israel is even smaller and more in despair, and the leadership more heavily controlled by Israeli settlers. This is an anomaly because the state of Israel was created with a Declaration of Independence that promised a Jewish and democratic state. There will not be a democratic Jewish state as long as Israel controls, governs over, using increasing repression and military power, a minority, or soon to be, if it isn't already a majority, of Palestinian Arabs who want a state of their own. So the vision of Israel's founding fathers has been betrayed. Can it be restored? I don't know the answer to that, but if it isn't, everyone faces further grief. Well, let's go a few more. One more. That's Jerusalem surrounded by the blue Israeli settlements, which have penetrated into East Jerusalem, which the Palestinians regard as their future capital. And the blue spots are maybe 5 or 10 times larger than they were when these maps were drawn. There is a wall on the Mount of Olives where Jesus descended on his donkey on the eve of the crucifixion. Another wall. There are walls everywhere. Walls designed to separate the people, and to kind of imprison the Palestinians, but not designed to bring peace. The little town of Bethlehem is a good example. It's a horrible scene. The Israelis had the wisdom to remove that "Welcome to Bethlehem" sign, but it's a pretty grim picture, as those of you who have been there have seen. Next. Any more on there? There we are. Everywhere you go, you see these structures for security, checkpoints, iron bars, concrete, massive concrete structures. Next. Waiting to get through at the checkpoint between the West Bank and Jerusalem. I was in this one. It took about 3 hours. And that is land which hasn't been built, but which the Israelis now threaten to build with settlements to completely cut off Jerusalem, and they think the potential for it becoming the capital of Palestine. Well, that brings us up to the Obama administration, which had a more aggressive view toward making peace. I should say more rhetorically aggressive. But when it came down to the tough decisions of condemning settlements, endorsing a Palestinian state, and using our massive leverage to change the situation on the ground, to give hope to the Palestinians, and to give pause to the Israelis that this was wrong and it wasn't going to work, Obama was not strong. And the weakness, the lack of willingness to deal with this situation, to hold the Palestinians accountable over the many, many years, was absorbed by the Israelis, who have assumed that the U.S. is their benefactor, protector, and will always be. And this is a part of our strategic calculus. This was not an act of friendship by the Americans, needless to say. It enabled the Israelis to do what otherwise they could not have done. So we bear a burden ourselves in what has happened since then. The Trump administration abjectly abandoned all of the structure of the, quote, peace process, the idea of two states or of Palestinian nationhood, and Jared Clinton's so-called grand scheme, which has not been resolved, I think will be seen as a sellout to the right-wing Israeli government. Not necessarily for ideological or religious reasons, although Jared has taken his instruction from our ambassador out there, David Friedman, who is a settler himself. He has a home in the settlements. The American Consul General in Jerusalem, where my wife and I lived for 3 years, will become the home of the American ambassador to Israel. Much nicer house. It was built in 1870 than his modern residence in Tel Aviv. Well, that's where we are now, and there's no sign that the Trump administration is going to change heart or begin to go back to the old pattern of negotiations, much less object to Israeli policy. And what that means, I think, is a very dark future for the Palestinians, needless to say, who, like other people, like the Jews in 1948, want security, nationhood, self-determination, and for the Israelis, who, as I say, are acting in a suicidal way because the critical factor here is demography, and the Palestinians are now an equal or greater part of the populace governed by the State of Israel, if you include the State of Israel itself, where 1/5 of the citizens are Palestinian Arabs and Israeli citizens, and the 3 million to 4 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. So it's it's a disaster now, but it's a disaster that's going to get worse. Now, I don't mean to exculpate the Palestinians entirely. They made a lot of mistakes. I think they naively assumed that ultimately the Americans and the international community would do the right thing. We didn't. They allowed their own politics to remain divided. Worst of all, they have participated in the division of the occupied territories in the struggle between Hamas, the Islamic party, and Fatah, the secular party. And they have not worked hard to reconcile that conflict. And that makes it virtually impossible to create a united Palestine that could effectively negotiate with Israel and with the rest of the world. So that is a big deal. They haven't been good negotiators. They've never been a state. They have been thwarted and discouraged every step of the way by the Israelis with the silent, implicit support of the United States, alas. Well, what's needed? Obviously, we've got to go back to a vigorous, aggressive peace process, because for strategic and for moral reasons, we can't afford to allow this to fester as we have for many years. Can we do it? It's very hard to predict, but we can. We have the resources, we have the experience that no one else has. We have the relationship with Israel that no one else has. Israel is still a volatile country. It is not true that the conquest of all of Palestine is permanently ordained. It could even be reversed. That is our challenge. That's a massive challenge. I'm very encouraged by the commitment of many, many Americans, Christians, and many American Jews too, because maybe a majority of the American Jewish community is now thoroughly fed up with the Netanyahu government and its policies, and with American policies. So there is hope, and all of you are doing a great thing to nourish that hope and participate in bringing peace in practical ways. So I'm not going to go on forever, and let's have some questions. Yes, ma'am.
We're going up the...
Yeah, okay. We're going to go up to the stage.
Yes. Here.
Uh-huh. That's okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
After you.
Okay.
So I know we don't have a lot of time, and I want to make sure we leave the floor open for questions. So I'm just going to start out with one quick question. So last fall, as a congregation, we spent a fair amount of time in a structured program focused on civil discourse, and really focusing on how to have productive dialogue with folks that we don't agree with. And just interested in your thinking, given this fraught and complex issue, what are your thoughts on how that kind of practice could be applied, either individually or as a congregation?
I think it's very important. Individually, there will not be enough change through that process to make a strategic difference. There are many, many Israelis for whom things have gone wrong and who basically share our values. We haven't paid enough attention to those Israelis, nor to their counterparts in the U.S., in the American Jewish community. And we need to do that. I do believe profoundly, though, that this conflict is not going to be solved by people-to-people diplomacy. It's going to be solved through hard and difficult diplomacy and power and influence. And Israel is a powerful state, but it is almost entirely beholden to the United States. And so we have enormous leverage and influence. We should use it.
I thought it might be worth
Just wait for the mic. Thanks.
I thought it might be worth adding a little domestic footnote to your points about the role of the American Jewish community, because in 47, 48, when George Marshall was counseling Truman not to embrace Israel, that position was being strongly supported by the patrician part of the American Jewish community. The German Jews, the Schiffs, the Goodmans, the Franks in New York, in Philadelphia, and in Boston were imploring Washington not to ally America with Israel. And I think that Anglicans need to know that our sort of Anglican counterparts in the Jewish community were on the right side of that issue. They didn't predominate, but they were there.
Quite right. And the idea that opposition to Israeli policy is anti-Semitic is a lie. Now, there are plenty of anti-Semites out there, but there are many more who acknowledge and respect the sovereignty of the state of Israel. They're not anti-Zionist. Now, there are others who are anti-Zionist, but still recognize that it has to be peace and that Israel is not going to be swept into the sea. This makes it much harder to join the forces of peace, because any concession you request of Israel is regarded as anti-Semitic. That is horrible, so reject that. The Jews themselves were predominantly anti-Zionists in the very early part of the century, until Israel grew strong and the Holocaust came along. Today, there is a notion of liberal Zionism, which means justice for Israel and justice for the Palestinians. Now, it's not thorough justice by any means, but even the liberal Zionists do not call for the destruction of Israel.
Mr. Ambassador, my daughter, who grew up here at St. John's, told me when she was embarking on her academic career that she wanted to specialize in the Middle East. And I asked her, or I pointed out that for cultural reasons, a woman expert in the Middle East would have special challenges. And so I said, why would you want to do that? And she said, because the problems are intractable and I'll always be employed. And now this was 30 years ago, and she is indeed still employed. So I would ask, if you would, to elaborate. You've spoken several times about leverage and the power that the U.S. government has. Could you give some more detail, please, from your point of view, as to how that indeed could be applied in ways that obviously you've suggested it has not yet been applied?
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, 3 cheers for your daughter. I'm sure she was not driven entirely by crass career considerations. There are a host of things we can do which would not imply rejection of the state of Israel or hostility toward the Jewish people. We've never done them. We have, for years, tried to sideline the United Nations, which created the state of Israel. The United Nations is a potentially useful, if not always influential, institution. And we have progressively rejected its right to engage in this conflict, even though the resolutions it has adopted form the basis of the body of international law on Israel and Palestine. So we should bring the UN back in as an active partner, not an enemy, just because the Israelis see it as an enemy because the UN wants to have 2 states, self-determination for the Palestinians and the end of the acquisition of territory by acts of force. So let's bring the UN back in. Let us put some real power behind our opposition to Israeli settlements. It is now a nominal, theoretical opposition because we've done nothing to stop it. briefly, in the Jim Baker, George H.W. Bush era, we did withhold some funds temporarily from our aid that were the equivalent of what was being spent on settlements, but that has vanished. We give massive amounts of money to Israel every year for its defense. Today, mostly for military defense. We give it, we don't lend it. And Israel is armed to the teeth. And we could temper the amount of our aid, given our desperate need for more funds for other countries. We have to be careful about how we do that. We would not abandon our security assistance to Israel, but we could begin to condition it and talk about settlements in the equation. We could urge that the U.S. government recognize the state of Palestine. It is a state. It's a state in waiting. We could have the United Nations memorialize that, make it legal through a resolution in the UN Security Council. There have been many such draft resolutions. We vetoed them all. We could ask the Security Council to again adopt, to consider a resolution making settlements illegal and imposing some sanctions for settlements. We have vetoed numerous resolutions of that kind. Barack Obama had the chance to do that, to both recognize Palestine, to support UN resolutions further outlawing settlements. The World Court has outlawed settlements now for the last 15 years. Those would have a profound effect on Israeli politics, because now they see us as their willing, if not enthusiastic, supporter. A Palestinian, an Israeli friend of mine, who I know very well, has said that if your friend is drunk, you don't give him the keys to your car. So we talk about how proudly we are Israel's best friend and defender. We are not. We have done deep and terrible harm to the state of Israel by supporting the destructive policies of its leadership over many, many years. I say that without hesitation. So there are a lot of things we can do. We can internationalize it. We can let others participate in a new peace process, stop trying to monopolize it so Israel can be protected. And that would have a major effect on Israeli public opinion, which is not sealed in concrete. But we have given them the illusion that we'll be there forever to protect them. We won't be. We shouldn't be now.
Hi. Thank you so much for just an excellent summary of the conditions in Palestine and Israel. I think that, as you've aptly pointed out, we need leadership that can negotiate. Do you foresee, and you've also noted that Netanyahu is not, he has his own problems in Israel at the moment. Do you foresee on that front any leadership rising out of the current political situation in Israel that might be more agreeable to negotiation?
Not right now. I think there's a good chance that after the Attorney General of Israel has said that Netanyahu will be indicted for a host of crimes, that he will be convicted, and that the expectation of that and the disgust of a lot of Israelis about his corruption will swing the election toward a new coalition. Benny Gantz, the retired chief of staff of the Israeli army, and Lapid, who is the head of a centrist, pragmatic secular party. I don't have much hope that Gantz or Lapid or their voters will endorse a Palestinian state or a radical change in Israeli policy toward this conflict. but they will at least not be Netanyahu, who is a liar, a cheat, a thoroughly irresponsible man who would do anything to stay in power. So if Netanyahu is voted out of office because he's expected to go to jail, that'll be a step forward, but not a major step. Will the U.S. be able to maintain the expertise, the diplomatic wherewithal to go back to what it was doing 10 years ago? I don't know. The State Department has been hollowed out. The people who know the issue and have worked on it over the years are getting a little long in the tooth, but we could do it. We have more knowledge and influence in this conflict than any other foreign nation, and we can resurrect that once we get rid of Trump.
You mentioned the failure of President Obama to do more, and you outlined a number of things that could be done. Can you say a little bit more about, in your view, why more wasn't done, and how much of that relates to his perception, perhaps, that there wasn't the political support for that within our system?
The Democratic Party has always been the strongest supporter of an unconditional supporter of Israel in the U.S. Until recently. The impact of political money in determining American policy is huge. And it's not as if the majority of American Jews were adamantly opposed to compromise or more sensible, effective American policies. There are a handful of infinitely rich American Jewish donors who make U.S. policy. People like Sheldon Adelson, who told Obama very early in the game that he wanted the American embassy to be moved to Jerusalem, and he gave hundreds of millions of dollars to Democrats in the last election. There are other mega millionaires, Jewish donors too, who have been very effective and who have engaged in this kind of political bribery. Netanyahu, I don't want to accuse Barack Obama from yielding to political bribery, but he was the president. He realized he had to have the support of the Democratic Party. He felt it was a bridge too far to do those things that I thought he should have done and could have done. Toward the end of his presidency, recognition of Palestinian state, a much tougher line on settlements, exacting some economic measures for accountability. It was crude and simple fear of political money, which is now unrestrained because of our Supreme Court. Obviously, the American people who want peace in the Middle East and who want other problems to be resolved should be deeply concerned about the corruption that has been wrought by this free-for-all of political money after the Citizens United case.
Actually, I first want to start by thanking you. I'm from Gaza, and I'm 28 years old, and I survived 3 wars till now. Since the day I was born, all what I saw is wars, bombs, darkness, no electricity. Till now, 12 years of siege, and every day we say things will change, but unfortunately, every day the situation is harder, and there is more and more suffering. We're used now to bombs, wars, it's part of our life, and every day you're just losing more and more beloved ones. So, and wherever you go, you hear about a suffering that ends and a war that has an end, but unfortunately in Palestine, it's just continuing forever. So my question is, when do you think this peace process will take place? Like, for how long when is the right time, or what should be done, and to put an end for this suffering?
I think it probably cannot be done today, given the willful ignorance of this administration, its obvious opposition to the kind of compromise that would be necessary for peace. But I think all of us should look forward to a change in the U.S. government and work for a dramatic change in American policy toward Israel and Palestine. And the Gaza situation in Gaza is one of the most flagrant examples of abuse of human beings. The U.S. has withdrawn its contribution to the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which was the largest of any nations. We created UNRWA as a member of the UN in 1949. And now UNRWA has been stripped of a very large part of its funding, which has provided for health care and education for millions of Palestinians. A disgrace. That's an area where even now you can lobby, because the Congress controls the funds to UNRWA, and if it wants to defy the president, it can do so. So I would work on UNRWA. I'm the member of an organization that raises private funds in the United States for UNRWA, and the Americans have been increasingly generous, and we have maybe experienced a 30–40% increase in our funds this year after the U.S. has withdrawn its contribution to UNRWA. So there's a willingness in this country to, not just by Palestinian Americans who are becoming very generous donors, but by American Christians, American Jews, and others.
On your last point, recently the U.S. cut its support for this Palestinian Authority. Can you just elaborate on the thinking and the politics behind that decision to cease to provide the funding to the Palestinian Authority? Is there a strategy behind it? What is the consequences? What are the objectives? Thank you.
I think there's no strategy behind it, except a misbegotten view that all of that land belongs to Israel. Israel should be our exclusive partner and ally in that part of the region. And the baneful notion that Palestinians are really not equal people who deserve the kind of justice and fairness that we accord to other people. It's a disgraceful policy, and it's a result of malignancy and ignorance. That's all I can say about it. I don't understand it because it is utterly destructive, illogical, and unprincipled.
So just a question on, I think you were elaborating on the traditional democratic support for the Israeli lobby. But I wonder are you seeing evidence now, and I think there's some talk in the news about that support starting to fray.
Yes.
And then also some movement in terms of progressive American Jews.
Yes.
Any thoughts in terms of how that, is that a positive trend? Is there room for optimism?
Well, yes, Bill, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because that is an absolutely critical element to change. That is to work to persuade what is the most important element in our society, in our policy toward Israel and Palestine. That is the American Jewish community, who feel deeply about Israel, but the majority of whom also feel deeply about their faith, the faith which conceives the idea of justice and of the character of all human beings as children of God, of respect and tolerance for other people who are not like you and who practice different faiths. And that element in Judaism is very strong. And the sort of hyper-patriotic pro-Israel substitute for Jewish religion is not ascendant. And groups like J Street, Americans for Peace Now, Jewish Voice for Peace, are working in the other direction to restore Jewish values to the American Jewish community. And it's having an effect, especially among the younger people who don't have that vivid memory of the Holocaust. So that's encouraging. We should do all we can to support those groups, donate to them, and ultimately it's going to be a matter of politics in the U.S. It might be the matter of some extraordinarily brave, charismatic new American president who could do this on his own, but I doubt it. There has to be a groundswell of support from America, and most of all, American Jews. And the alliance between peace-minded American Christians and American Jews is critical.
Ambassador, I think we're at time, so I appreciate you being with us today, and I think we will take up many of these themes in the upcoming forums.
Good. Thank you all.